One of the most common recurring topics on my channel is when horrifying, disgusting things happen involving the human body. Sometimes it's something a person did to themselves, sometimes it's something they did to others, and a lot of times it's just a matter of unfortunate circumstances. So for today's video, let's take a look at some of these gross instances of body horror and hope they never happen to you. This video is sponsored by Thesis. Thesis makes supplements that help with energy and focus. They help you improve your mood, motivation, creativity, and focus with naturally derived ingredients like lion's mane, ashwagandha, and mango leaf. Here's how it works. Take a short quiz to get recommended blends. Try them out your first month, and customize your box with what worked for you. The right blend should make you feel more awake, focused, and productive. It seemed like I had the most notable effects with the creativity blend. Although really I would describe it as more of a motivated feeling than a creative feeling necessarily. Like I often have a hard time getting started on my work for the day, and I felt like when I was taking that particular blend, it was slightly less of a struggle. Everyone's brain chemistry is different, and we all react to things differently, so it's important to find the blend that works specifically for you. But with any supplement you take, there's a lot of different factors going on, so it can be hard to assess it specifically yourself. That's why Thesis uses ingredients that have been clinically studied, and each batch is third-party tested. Take the free 3-minute quiz to see what your brain needs. Just click the link below and use code WANG to save $60 off your first purchase when you sign up with Thesis. In November of 1966, Walt Disney was diagnosed with lung cancer. Famously a heavy smoker for most of his life, it wasn't entirely surprising, but it was still a shocking discovery that unfortunately came far too late to treat effectively. The procedures he endured, including the full removal of his left lung, did little to stave off the illness that at this point had spread throughout his entire body. Barely a month later, on December 15th, he would pass away due to complications caused by the cancer. 2 days after his death, he was cremated and his ashes were eventually kept at a family plot in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, a memorial that you can visit to this very day. But it's likely that you've heard a different story about Walt Disney's death. That Walt Disney wasn't actually cremated, that he had been cryogenically frozen in hopes of bringing him back to life someday. There's a lot of factors that fed into this urban legend. Some of the reporting around Disney's death at the time was a little confusing, some of it fraught with misinformation. And at the time of his death, cryogenic freezing was seemingly making advances and even inviting its first real candidates. With Walt Disney's vast resources and his known interest in futuristic technologies, it's absolutely plausible that if anyone would be taking this leap into the future, it would be Walt Disney. Although cryogenically freezing a person to bring them back to life at a later date is largely believed to be impossible, there is a sizable, deeply committed contingent of people who disagree. And as of me making this video, there's roughly 500 people that are currently frozen, with thousands more on waiting lists. But there's several others who were frozen in the past and didn't quite get the results they signed up for. So for today, let's talk about the truth, the myth, and the horror of cryogenic freezing. There's always been something that's fascinated me about cryogenic freezing, although I never really looked that deeply into the technology. I remember one year for a school science fair, I tried to cryogenically freeze crickets in Tupperware in my freezer. Unfortunately, I was not able to bring them back to life. I think I might have tried this because I remember reading about this thing you can do where you freeze a fly, then you tie a string around it and unfreeze it, and you got a fly on a leash. Apparently that actually is a thing you can do though. There's actually a guy on YouTube, Drum Lewis, with a video of him doing this. And while I was looking up whether or not you can actually do this, I came across this horrifying Reddit comment about a guy who tried this with a goldfish. When I was in 5th grade or so, as a science experiment, I left a goldfish in a bag of water in the freezer overnight. The next afternoon, I thawed out the solid block of ice and successfully revived the goldfish. He seemed no worse for wear, until 3 days later, all his skin fell off and he died. In any case though, humans aren't goldfish and we're not flies unless, you count Seth Brundle. But I think the Walt Disney myth is most people's point of reference for the idea of cryogenically freezing a human. So let's take a look at why this belief exists. The urban legend is often said to have been started by a magazine called The National Spotlight. The National Spotlight was known for stories like Cured by Elvis's Healing Hands, America Needs Nudism to End Crime, and How UFOs Control Our Minds. Clearly a very trustworthy news source. Supposedly, shortly after Walt Disney died, a reporter for the National Spotlight snuck into the hospital he was being treated at disguised as an orderly. He broke into the storage room where he made a horrifying discovery: Walt Disney's body, sealed and frozen in a tube. That being said, I've seen some doubt that this article actually exists. I've even seen doubt that the National Spotlight exists, although we can go on eBay right now and buy a few issues, so it did exist at some point. Some publications, such as Snopes, perhaps uncomfortable with the idea of citing this impossible-to-find National Spotlight article, claim that the source was actually a French publication called Ici Paris in 1969. But I did manage to find a few publications that make reference to a specific National Spotlight article entitled "Walt Disney is Frozen, He'll Be Back in 1975, and attributed to a writer named Bill Burnett. So I do think this article likely did exist and is probably the first published source for the rumor. Although it's been said that the rumor actually started within Disney itself as a joke among staff. Despite the nature of the publication that this story originated from, it still persists. To the point where some people are going to watch this video and be like, no, you're wrong, Walt Disney is frozen. And this rumor would evolve over the decades with little details added. Suddenly, Walt Disney was obsessed with his own mortality and trying to find ways to live forever. And that he had often specifically spoken about the possibility of freezing himself. That there was a weird amount of secrecy around his funeral. It was said that Disney created a movie called Frozen so that it would be more difficult to look up the facts about Walt Disney's frozen body. And at some point, it was said that he was stored right under Pirates of the Caribbean in Disneyland. Most recently, there was a screenshot making the rounds, mostly on Facebook, that Disney would be unfrozen in December of 2021 on the 55th anniversary of his death. The source of that being, much like the original story, a fake news publication, which in this case literally says it's not quite news. But just because Walt Disney isn't frozen, that doesn't mean there aren't people who are frozen. In fact, the very first person who was cryogenically frozen with the intention of bringing them back to life happened mere weeks after Walt Disney died. Every year on January 12th, cryonics enthusiasts celebrate a day known as Bedford Day, named for psychology professor James Bedford, who was frozen on January 12, 1967. Although there are other people who had their bodies frozen before Bedford, he's generally considered to be the first true example of cryogenic preservation. An article published in 1991 by For the Record entitled "The First Suspension" documents some of the previous failed attempts. There were a number of people who died before Bedford and had agreed to be frozen, but they couldn't proceed because of disagreements with family members, or doctors who were unwilling to help with the process. And if you want to freeze someone to bring them back to life, you gotta get things moving right away. There's no time for red tape. The closest they got before Bedford was an anonymous woman who died of a heart attack, but she had already been embalmed before she was frozen, which is a no-go if you want to be revived. But still, that was considered an important step towards the real thing. Bedford, who had been suffering from kidney cancer, was extremely passionate about cryogenic preservation, and even left money to cryonic research in his will. And knowing about all the problems that could occur when he died, and knowing that the clock was ticking for him, he made sure that he had all of his ducks in a row. And even with all that effort, his family still had to deal with legal issues. But by then, he had already been frozen shortly after his death. His freezing was overseen by a man named Robert Nelson, a former TV repairman who created the Cryonic Society of California. Bedford's body was injected with a solution intended to protect his organs from the freezing process. Although the materials they used are considered primitive by today's standards, and they likely didn't do a great job of protecting his brain, it was the best they had at the time, and still better than embalming fluid. He was then placed in a metal container called a douar. Bedford's douar was created by a man named Ed Hope, whose primary profession was making wigs. I love how that knowledge just instantly strips away any illusions you might have about what an advanced scientific process this was. And you may be thinking that this guy Ed Hope, sure he was a wig maker, but maybe he was just really passionate about the technology. A lot of people were at the time. And that's how science is sometimes, especially in the early days of a new technology. Some kind of citizen scientists, a modern day Ben Franklin. Nah, the truth is, Ed Hope just thought he could make a few bucks from this. And it wouldn't be that long after that he realized that he really couldn't make a few bucks off of this. James Bedford remains frozen to this day, but he is the only one of his contemporaries that does. And many of these people met with horrifying ends, largely in the aftermath of Ed Hope pulling the plug on his company, CryoCare. A 1992 article by For the Record entitled "Suspension Failures, Lessons from the Early Years" goes into some of these incidents. Basically, after realizing that CryoCare wasn't going to be as profitable as he thought, Ed Hope pulled the plug on the company. But now he's got all these dead bodies in jars to get rid of. You can't just throw them in the garbage or have a clearance sale. These are people. You gotta make some kind of arrangements. One example the article talks about is a woman named Eva Schulman. There is very little chance of ever bringing her back to life because before she was frozen, she had already been autopsied. Way too much time passed, but they froze her anyway because, hey, you got the cash, we got the metal tubes. So Ed Hope turns this woman's body over to her son, who keeps it on dry ice in his truck. Dry ice, which although it's very cold, is nowhere near as cold as the liquid nitrogen they use to preserve these bodies. So this dude's just driving his truck around with his mother's stinky autopsied lukewarm corpse in it. Like at that point, you're basically just desecrating the body. Like this is some kind of goofy mission you do early on in a GTA game. Eventually, he gets her a normal burial though. And then you have the case of what's known as the Chatsworth incident. So Robert Nelson, the man who froze James Bedford, owns the Cryonics Society of California. He receives one of the bodies from Ed Hope, a man named Louis Nisco, who chose this company because they were the least expensive. Nelson continues to freeze more people, and he keeps them on dry ice in a mortuary. The mortuary is run by a man named Joseph Clockgather, who eventually decides that he doesn't want a bunch of frozen bodies laying around his mortuary. So Nelson comes up with a solution. They cut open Nisco's douar, remove his body from its supports, and then just stuff them all in there. I was told some were put in head first, some feet first, and it was like putting together a Chinese puzzle. The placement took most of a night. The bodies were not deliberately thawed, but must have suffered substantial warming, though according to Clockgather, they were still frozen. Then a welder resealed the capsule, which required a wait of several more hours, and it was refilled with liquid nitrogen. It's clear that at this point, Nelson had more or less given up on maintaining the integrity of these bodies. Like, even if you could thaw them out and revive them, moving them around like this had to damage them to the point where there's just no shot. But because Nelson's rates were so low, more and more people kept on coming to him to store their frozen dead relatives. So he wound up getting an underground vault at a cemetery in Chatsworth. He would eventually stuff 3 more bodies in a single capsule, this time one of them belonging to a dead 8-year-old girl. And that wasn't the only frozen child in his possession. There was also a 6-year-old boy who died of leukemia. His body wound up cracking, likely due to being frozen too fast. Meanwhile, Nelson would establish a sister operation in New Jersey, this one run by a cop named Nicholas de Blasio. In 1969, de Blasio's wife Anne would die of breast cancer. She was frozen by the Cryonics Society of New York. After speaking to Nelson, de Blasio was convinced that he could store his wife more cheaply on his own. And supposedly he also liked that he could see his wife frozen in a lifelike position. Ironically though, de Blasio's operations seemed to have less problems than Nelson's did. That is, until one disastrous incident. De Blasio also had capsules that contained multiple bodies. One of them malfunctioned after the lid was damaged opening it, so they take the bodies out, put them on ice, repair the lid and put them back. Then a year later, this happens again. And then another year later, this happens a third time. The third time, they finally say, you know what, we can't do this, it's done. So they arrange to give these people a proper burial, but they also have to salvage the capsule. It's a very expensive piece of equipment. A man named Mike Darwin would wind up having to scrape the liquefied human remains out of the bottom of the capsule. Back in Chatsworth, suspicion starts to arise about Nelson's operations, and his crypt is opened by local reporters. The stench near the crypt is disarming, wrote one reporter. Strips away all defenses, spins the stomach into 1,000 dizzying somersaults. The absolute state of decay in this crypt would lead to a big lawsuit by some of the families. But Nelson maintained that he had done nothing wrong, and that he had actually continued to maintain these tanks after the family stopped paying him, and ultimately he just chalked this all up to a failed experiment. I haven't done anything criminal, anything wrong other than a lot of bad decisions. It didn't work. It failed. There was no money. Who can guarantee that you're going to be suspended for 10 or 15 years? Ultimately, he would lose the lawsuit. But while Joseph Clockgather would wind up paying $400 grand, Nelson would only ever pay attorney's fees, despite being ordered to pay out over $1 million. After several decades passed, he would go on to recount his experiences in a 2014 book entitled Freezing People is Not Easy. In the book, he argues that he previously made arrangements with the families who wound up suing him, and that they were really just after the insurance money. He also explains that he wasn't just some businessman out to scam people, and that he genuinely was interested in cryonics. And then 4 years later in 2018, he passed away. Upon his death, he himself was frozen. As for James Bedford, he managed to avoid all of this trouble because his son was so dedicated to making sure he was always taken care of. He's presently being taken care of by the Alker Life Extension Foundation. And although this company is generally regarded as being immeasurably more professional than those that came before them, they're not without their own share of incidents. Perhaps most famously, the story of Ted Williams. I'm not talking about Ted Williams, the man with the golden voice, who as far as I'm aware is still alive and not frozen, and still has his head attached. I'm talking about the baseball player Ted Williams. So I'm not a huge baseball fan, so as far as I can gather, he's generally regarded to be one of the greatest of all time. And in 2002, after a multiple year battle with heart disease and several procedures, he passes away at the age of 83. Unlike most of the other candidates for cryonic preservation, this was quite possibly not his choice. According to his will, Ted Williams wanted to be cremated, but ultimately it was his daughter Claudia and his son John Henry who had him frozen instead. This leads to a big legal battle between them and his other children. But the children in favor of cryonic preservation would wind up presenting a note scrawled on a napkin signed by Ted Williams. It was an agreement that he would be frozen so that they could perhaps be together at a later date. A note scrawled on a napkin brought into court is, to quote a great man,
more sus than a character from Among Us.
But after investigating the note for potential fraud charges, a lab determined that it was actually authentic. So perhaps this really was what he wanted. But the procedure he received was a bit different from the others we heard about so far. Ted Williams was decapitated, with his head stored separately from his body. It's a procedure called neuro-preservation. In theory, if you wanted to bring a person back from the dead and just keep the things that make them them, you only really need the head. Who needs a liver and kidneys and all that other crap? And in preserving the head by itself, there's a lot less that can go wrong. That's not to say though that nothing can go wrong. According to a report by Sports Illustrated several months after Ted died, his frozen head, which had been shaven and drilled into, had accidentally cracked 10 times. Also, a bunch of samples of his DNA just mysteriously vanishes for who knows what nefarious purposes. And at the time of publication, Alker was still owed $111,000 for the procedure. So Ted Williams, like most people who opt for neuropreservation, get decapitated from the start. But sometimes that happens at a later date. In 1984, Mike Darwin of Alker, who you might recall as the guy who scraped out the liquefied human remains in New Jersey, published research discussing the conversion of full-body preservation patients to neuropreservation patients. Conversion meaning they literally cut their frozen heads off with chainsaws. In doing this, they were afforded a rare opportunity to see what happens to a body after it's unfrozen after a long time. Essentially getting a little insight into what might actually happen if they reach their goal of reviving someone. What he found was that each of the bodies was full of fractures. Fractures that he compared to the appearance of paint peeling away from a wall. Fractures that occurred both on the skin and in the organs. But these findings weren't totally unexpected. In fact, he suspected that there was also damage at a molecular level that we just couldn't see with our eyes. He believed that these challenges weren't fully insurmountable, but he urged readers to opt for neuropreservation instead of full body. This is one reason why so many of us have elected for neuropreservation as opposed to whole body storage. The kind of repair technology which will likely have to be available to repair our brains will make regrowth of a new body a trivial exercise by comparison. New bodies are grown every day in nature right now, while freeze-injured and cryo-fractured brains are not repaired in nature at all. We urge everyone who is whole body to rethink the basis of their choice. If the basis of choice is concern over a severed spinal cord or emotional concerns not related to the hard facts, we urge you to reconsider. So there you have it, folks. If you're thinking of getting frozen after you die, be sure to go Futurama style. But while the cryonics industry pushes further towards technological advancement and refinement, as futile as it may be depending on who you ask, there are still those who freeze their dead relatives the old-fashioned way. Every year since 2002, residents of Nederland, Colorado celebrate something called Frozen Dead Guy Days. The story goes like this. Bretto Morstel was the director of Parks and Recreation in Bærum County, Norway. He passed away in 1989 due to a heart condition, and his grandson, I'm absolutely going to mutilate this guy's name, Trygve Baug. He had Bretto frozen and brought to the US. Originally, he was kept in the Trans-Time Cryonics facility in Oakland, before he was eventually brought to Colorado to stay with Trygve and his mother, Aud. Like Nelson and de Blasio before them, they intended to make their own facility. But for now, they would just put Bretto in a shed and keep him frozen on their own. Trygve would eventually be deported due to visa issues, leaving Aud by herself. And while she was alone in 1995, she was going to be evicted for having no plumbing and electricity. Being evicted, of course, would jeopardize her ability to keep him frozen. So in hopes of getting her situation resolved, she brought her concerns to a local reporter. The reporter would then go to the city council on her behalf. And as a result, the city council passed a law banning keeping dead bodies at your house. So now Odd had to get rid of the body and pay even more fines. But the story got a lot of attention and it generated a big public outcry. And thus, Grandpa Bretto was allowed to stay frozen. To this day, thousands of pounds of dried ice are brought to him every few weeks so that he may stay frozen. And Grandpa Bretto would become such a local legend that in 2002, an event called the Frozen Dead Guy Days Festival was created. The celebration of him grew into a festival with contests, food, music. Tens of thousands of people come each year. At one point, you could even go and add ice to his container yourself. Although more recently, it seems like his caretakers have grown a bit uncomfortable with that, reasonably so. They also have no idea what the actual state of the body is right now, although I imagine it can't be that great. Have you ever wound up with a bad case of the gamer leg? In case you don't know what I'm talking about, take a look at this post that's been going around recently. And like a lot of people, I was wondering what this actually is. Because see, to the best of my knowledge, this man is not blue cheese flavored, nor is he cookies and cream flavored, and he probably doesn't taste like blueberry muffins. I haven't tasted it myself, so I can't say for sure, but it seems unlikely. And the more this image spread, the more theories I saw about what this actually is. Most of them completely off the mark. But as it turns out, the owner of this leg actually came out to tell the real story. So for today's episode of Tales from the Internet, let's take a look at a condition known as gamer leg. You might be surprised to hear that I've seen a lot of gross shit in my time online, but there's always specifically been something about diseases that actually bothers me extra. I don't know what it is, I've just been always a little more skeeved out by it than most other stuff on gore sites that people consider worse. I think it's just something about the unknown factor here. You look at it and you're like, is this contagious? Will I get it? Is there anything that I can do to prevent myself from getting it? And this one has no context, it's just a caption that says, anyone else have gamer leg? And it just looks straight zombified. You got patches of gray skin with scabs and open sores. And among all the jokes, people are really trying to figure out what this is. It's clearly not something that a little moisturizer will help, even if you pay top dollar for the drunken elephant stuff. One suggestion that I saw a lot was the bubonic plague. And you might be like, wait a minute, I thought they wiped out the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages. They didn't. In fact, it still exists all over the world, including the western half of the US. On average, we get 7 cases a year. These cases generally come from flea bites from fleas that were carried by rodents. That being said though, the bubonic plague is actually very treatable now, and it's very rare to actually die if you get it. And it looks nothing like this leg. The leg looks worse than the plague. Another common theory that I saw that this was the effects of poorly managed diabetes. Issues in the feet and legs from diabetes can manifest in a lot of different ways, but they generally don't look like this leg. Probably of everything I saw suggested, the closest match was scabies. Scabies, if you've forgotten from health class, is a parasitic infection that you sometimes get as an STD, but you can actually get it from any prolonged skin-to-skin contact. And some of the more severe cases do kind of resemble this, but the gamer leg picture clearly has a lot of necrotizing skin. On occasion, you will see a case of scabies where that happens, but it's super rare, something like 4% of cases. And when it does manifest, it's usually not as severe as this leg. But here's the thing, while we're all having our minds blown by this picture of a limb that looks like it was handcrafted by Tom Savini, myself included, for members of the fighting game community, this was old news. This was already an important piece of ancient lore. As it turns out, the leg belonged to a pro gamer named Marn. Marn had competed since 2005 and was most known for Guilty Gear. He also competed in various Street Fighter and Marvel vs. titles, as well as a Dragon Ball title. So technically, it really was gamer leg. The gamer leg situation came to be in July of 2014. Marn had been posting about this condition, showing the onset until it developed into the infamous gamer leg picture. The picture starts to make the rounds first inside the fighting game community, and then it breaches containment, spilling out all over the internet. In particular, this one post on r/WTF blows up. A top 5 hospital in the country doesn't even know WTF this is. The comments were filled with a lot of same speculation that we all saw in the recent posts, with the addition of some other theories, like one that was posted about a woman with a condition who made her suddenly grow fingernails instead of hair. But this time, Marn himself came to set the record straight. Hi, that's my leg. To clear up the lies and bullshit about everything posted here, I decided to post the real story. 3 weeks prior to making this post, he noticed some bumps on his foot that he thought were mosquito bites. This wound up spreading throughout his arms, his legs, and his butt. The doctors told him this was a condition called HS purpura. HS purpura is a type of vasculitis that causes a distinct purple rash. Basically, the blood vessels in your skin, intestines, kidneys, and joints get inflamed and they bleed inside of you. The doctor told him that this isn't contagious and he gave him an antibiotic and steroid to treat it. He was also tested for diabetes and his blood work was fine. And note that it's important to the story that the doctor told him it's not contagious, because shortly after he would be attending a major tournament, and some people would accuse him of knowingly spreading an infectious disease. In fact, from what I saw, some people still think that's what happened. In any case, the doctor advised him to not go to the tournament just because his body's going through a lot, he needs rest. But he went anyway. It wasn't a great decision. During the day, it feels fine, slowly deteriorating until nighttime where I couldn't even walk. At night, it's unbearable burning pain where I couldn't even sleep. I never had fevers, chills, or anything, just intense burning, throbbing pain. I'd sat down and played blackjack for a couple hours into the morning because it hurt to lay down. Unfortunately, I got up from blackjack and felt really dizzy, blacking out on the casino floor for a couple of minutes. Afterwards, I got up and felt completely refreshed. Some people suggested that he tried to soak with Epsom salts to help with the pain, but it didn't really do that much. Eventually, the pain gets so severe that he has to go to the ER. They give him an IV, fill him up with some antibiotics, they run some tests, and his blood work and ultrasound look fine. These doctors advise him to go see UCLA Medical, and that visit came sooner than expected. Later that night, he had to go to the ER because his pain was so severe, on top of throwing up the contents of an empty stomach. So his friend takes him to the UCLA emergency room at 6 a.m. And basically he just goes through the same procedure again, IV, antibiotics, tests. Once again, everything looks fine. They give him something to numb his stomach pain and tell him to set up an appointment with a dermatologist. And at the time of his post, he was waiting for that appointment. So now I just wait till Tuesday. The pus is oozing out by itself with a foul, rotten smell, but it's all scabbing up. At night, my left leg still gives out on me. That's basically it. Only pus from my legs, but there's spots all over my legs and arms. He would later come back and edit the post to address claims that he picked up the disease in Vietnam. I did go to Vietnam from January to April of this year. This happened last week of June. I haven't been sick much in my life. My parents and brother have never had this. I had chickenpox when I was young. Everything depends on the appointment on Tuesday, I guess. Oh, and Marina ER doctor says she thinks it's vasculitis with a secondary infection, but not sure. Tuesday would arrive and he would come back to the thread with an update. Went to the dermatologist of UCLA today. They didn't even seem worried. Said it was vasculitis or PLEVA. They cut into my leg and arm for 2 different biopsies, stitched it up, and sent me on my way. They prescribed me a month's worth of doxycycline, which I can't afford, so I'm probably going to die. Then they brought in 3 to 4 UCLA medical students to look at my stuff and explained why it's probably PLEVA/vasculitis and stuff. So PLEVA is described by the National Library of Medicine as follows. PLEVA is a relatively benign cutaneous disorder of unclear origin that affects children and young adults. Patients present with a spontaneous eruption of erythematous macules that evolved into papules, rapidly undergoing hemorrhagic necrosis and ulceration. It generally just goes away on its own, but that can take weeks or it can take years, and sometimes just comes back out of nowhere. It's also important to note that they don't really know what causes it. When I made the short versions of this video for TikTok and Instagram, I noticed a lot of comments because he's a bigger dude that, oh man, now I'm so scared, I'm never gonna let myself get to that point. And it's good to be fit for a lot of reasons, but in this case, it probably won't save you. Although they don't know exactly what causes this, there is some evidence that it might be a weird immune response to some kind of viral or bacterial infection, or possibly the medicine used to treat such infections. But they haven't been able to identify exactly how it works. In any case, Martin's leg did clear up, he didn't get it amputated, he didn't make tacos out of it. And as far as I know, he didn't die. I saw a few people saying that he did die, but I think that stems from this joke memorial video that came out in 2012. But anyway, that's the story behind Gamerleg. On September 4th of 2015, Men's Health published an article entitled, "Why You Can't Keep Your Hands Out of Your Pants." The article is a science-based exploration of the phenomenon of men just casually grabbing their junk. And I'm not necessarily talking, playing with yourself. You're sitting around, you give it a little grab. You're just sitting around, you give it a little grab. People don't really talk about it, but it's a thing that you do. And you catch yourself doing it, and you're like, what am I even doing here? One of the theories that was presented in this article is that this is some kind of evolutionary instinct to protect yourself. If you're at home trying to relax, it stands to reason that you'll be more relaxed if your junk is protected. Vanessa Van Edwards, who researches human behavior, told them, you could think of the hand there like insurance against a friend who might give him a nut jab, or a kid who accidentally hits a ball at them.
My groin!
It's an instinct that served us well throughout evolutionary history. But if you watch my channel long enough, you know that not everyone shares our same self-preservation instincts. So for today's video, let's take a look at men who have mutilated themselves in horrifying and sometimes comedic ways. On April 22nd of 2007, a 35-year-old Polish man entered a Zizi in central London. Zizi is a chain of restaurants with over 135 locations across the UK. They're known for putting their own spin on classic Italian dishes, like their oblong rustica pizza pies, stuffed garlic balls, and fried pasta crisps. Fittingly for this story, Zizi is also a French term for penis. You see, this Polish man was not looking for a menu packed with Italian-inspired dishes with twists in theater, warm and natural restaurants with playful, fun touches, and a team that make you feel like you're among friends. No, what he was looking for was a knife, and he found it in Zizi's kitchen. Stuart McMahon, who is one of the nearly 200 witnesses to this incident, explained it to The Sun. This guy came running in, then charged into the kitchen, got a massive knife, and started waving it about. Everyone was screaming and running out as he jumped on a table, dropped his trousers, and popped his penis out. Then he cut it off. I couldn't believe it. The staff were really upset and there was blood everywhere. I just picture that one bar scene from The Wizard of Gore where there's a dead body in there and people are running in like a circular cartoonish manner, jumping over the dead body and whatnot, except now they're jumping over the penis. Police incapacitated the man with tear gas, then they collected his pecker from the floor. It was put on ice and he was rushed to the hospital for reattachment surgery, which was apparently the first of its kind in the UK. Although he did make it to stable condition, it's unclear whether or not the reattachment surgery was a success. A urologist who spoke to The Guardian noted that if it didn't take, they may have to cut it off and do it all over again. And if it did work, he'd have still lost sensation and need a penis pump for the rest of his life. After the procedure, the man would undergo a psychiatric evaluation, although as one person who spoke to The Sun noted, he's clearly not a well boy. Our next penile self-harm story is a bit more accidental, and it happens over a very long term. In a Reddit thread entitled, TIFU by not cleaning my penis for 16 years, a user named FewNotice9304 details his journey of self-discovery. At the age of 16, he got interested in porn a lot older than a lot of his peers. And up to that point, he had basically no exposure to other men's tunnel snakes.
Tunnel snakes rule!
And it was only at this point that he realized that his didn't quite look like theirs. Because most of the men in the porns he was watching were circumcised, whereas he was intact. But he did see some with uncut men, and he noticed that they were able to just retract the foreskin. He had never thought to do that. So, you know, monkey see, monkey do, he tried to do that. But he couldn't because it was so tight. This is a condition known as phimosis. It's relatively common at a young age, but you usually outgrow it. Sometimes people are circumcised to treat this, but it's typically not necessary. Sometimes though, you're not born with it and you develop it as a result of infections or injuries or scars or whatnot. In any case, FewNotice decides that he's just going to try and loosen it up himself. I finally started to make progress, but I began to notice a white material under my foreskin. At first, he thought this was just pieces of dried toilet paper, but he would look it up and learn that this was called smegma. But he noticed that, unlike the descriptions he found online, his smegma was very hard. He compared the texture to clay, and he just keeps picking at it. I kept going further and larger chunks became visible. It was like an iceberg, where initially only the tip is showing, but there's a lot hidden underneath. I noticed that each chunk was painful and tender to take off. I got further and further down the head, where eventually, one shower, it slipped all the way down. And that's when he finds the biggest smegma deposit of all. It was burning. My penis head had never been exposed properly, and with the shower water on it, it was so painful. But I kept pushing through to get all the smegma off of the head. It was like it had formed its own map onto my penis, with indents on the head I still have today. And then he noticed the discoloration. Parts of what was now exposed were purple and swollen, while other parts were gray and completely numb. He had a theory on why this was. I was devastated. I could only guess that the gray part was for me sleep with it erect under my stomach face down, and as my penis grew, the hard smegma was constantly rubbing it and damaging the nerves, hence the gray. The swollen purple was most likely from the more recent masturbation. Why did he spell masturbation like that? Masturbation, where I'd forcefully jerk my penis, but not realizing I had clay rubbing the head. He expresses anger at his father for not teaching him better, anger at himself for not knowing better and possibly stunting his own penile growth, and anger at other men for not having harmed themselves in this way. He notes that in the following years the purple reduced a bit, and the gray parts are still gray, but there's increased sensation now. He also noted though that certain acts such as receiving head can be painful. He describes this first time and having his legs shoot up in pain. We joked about it later, like, damn, the head was that good? It jolted life into you? But I hate breaking it to girls, I don't enjoy it. He ends with a PSA to educate your sons and potentially yourself. Although as one commenter pointed out, it could have been worse. You could have found out during your first time. The smell or taste would have been life-changing horrific for the girl. And honestly, at first, this story was sounding kind of phony to me, because I mean, how could you go 16 years of your life and not notice that something was wrong here? But apparently, a few commenters had a similar situation. Like, I guess this is more common than people realize. Same shit almost happened to me, but I managed to salvage it when I was like 13 before it got bad. Couple Google searches later and it all made sense. I guess I should count myself super lucky that I got hit by a giant wave at 14/15 while surfing that somehow made mine fully retract for the first time. By the time I realized why my crotch was feeling so weird, it looked perfectly clean from the salt water, lol. And it's not just these two, there's several comments in the replies from people who learned at a surprisingly old age that they should have been cleaning themselves all these years. And which also gave me the terrible thought that there might be someone watching this video who is just realizing this because of this video. It's not your fault though, it's your parents' fault. I mean, maybe it's your fault a little bit. The next story comes to us from the proud nation of Ghana, land of beautiful, horrifying movie posters, like the Tales from the Internet one I have for sale in my store. You know, as a kid, I always thought sleepwalking was something just made up for cartoons. It turned out that quicksand was a thing that they were really exaggerating, and sleepwalking is quite real, and often quite dangerous. But of all the real-life instances of sleepwalking, this is probably the most horrifying one that I've heard. So one night in August of 2022, a 47-year-old farmer named Kofi Ata was preparing dinner for his family. As a farmer, he has access to some of the freshest meat possible. So he takes his knife and he kills one of his goats to prepare for dinner. And then he wakes up, and there's blood everywhere and his balls hurt. As it turned out, he had not slaughtered a goat. Rather, he had slaughtered his own wiener. He starts screaming in pain and his neighbors rush to his aid. And upon finding the horrifying scene, they call his wife, who rushes home to see him holding on to his schmeckle and bleeding out into a pot. She puts a diaper on him to try and stop the bleeding. Which, you know, there's some people in the world that would be like, God, I wish that was me. And then she brings him to the hospital where he receives fluids and injections, and they were able to save his life, but he'd have to wait a bit until getting reattachment surgery. It's important to note that throughout all this, he hadn't even realized what he had done. Until he got to the hospital, he was perceiving all of this as still being part of the dream. But it's like Jamie Josta said, when I wake up, the real nightmare begins. Our next story isn't as graphic, but it's a classic tale of a guy trying to find new and exciting ways to get off and it going horribly wrong. TIFU by spraying Afrin nasal spray up my penis. So Afrin is a nasal spray that's used for treating allergies and congestion. It's a bit more advanced than a simple saline rinse, like something you'd get from a neti pod or a Navage. And I just considered the possibility of someone putting a Navage in their fucking pee hole, which if you don't know what that is, it's like a nasal irrigation thing with suction. So if someone tried to do that, they would probably, what's the term? They would give themselves like a urethral prolapse, which honestly would be an incredible name for a band. In any case, Afrin isn't just a saltwater rinse, it's a medicated spray, which also means it has more risk of side effects. The poster begins by explaining his reasoning for doing this. I thought that, since it clears up your nose so well, maybe it would clear up the penis in a similar way.
You, sir, are an idiot.
As in, widen the inside of the urethra so out with less resistance. Basically, I wanted to make some epic cum shots. Turns out it doesn't work that way at all. You know, this guy is trying to come up with his own ways to have a big cum, and he never came across the advice to just take zinc and L-arginine. The thing about Afrin though, the way it works is that it's a vasoconstrictor. It reduces irritation by shrinking your blood vessels. Great for a stuffy nose, not ideal for sexual activity. So he's about to get it in with his girlfriend, and he sneaks off to the bathroom to fill himself up with Afrin. He's all set to cocoon this girl in a load like those trapped women in Duke Nukem 3D. But instead, he couldn't get hard because that's how Afrin would work in that situation. Constricting your blood vessels down there is the opposite of what you want. So of course he explained to his girlfriend why this was happening, and she makes fun of him for it to this very day. Honestly, I'm just in love with his reasoning here, that you could come bigger if only you weren't so stuffed up. Now, when I was working on this video, there was a particular story that I remembered from so many years ago. It's a story that scared me off from using psychedelic drugs because a guy in an LSD-induced rage just cuts his dick off. So I was looking for that particular story, and then I found that this has happened so many times. When you look for it now, the incident that seems to come up the most is one in 2016 France. A group of people were having some sort of get-together in an apartment, and one guy had taken LSD, and he was having a bad trip. He had what witnesses described as a fit of madness. During the fit of madness, he attacks his girlfriend, who had light injuries that needed to be treated at the hospital. He had also at some point partially severed his penis. None of the reports elaborate on how partial, but I'm just picturing, like, you ever bite a sausage, but you don't get all the way through the casing, so it just kind of dangles? Something like that is what I'm thinking. The most horrifying part of that, though, it's not really clear when he did that. He might have wandered off to the bathroom, did it in there, and then pulled his pants back up, and it's just getting smushed all around. The fit comes to an abrupt end when he jumps out of a second-story window. He's not okay. Although he did manage to survive the incident, the permanence of his injuries is unclear. Then you have another situation in 2017 in Chicago. This one has ample photographic evidence, which I mostly can't show you. Police received reports of a naked man on a drug-induced rampage a block away from an elementary school, and he's walking around and bleeding from his crotch as he had previously, as the Sun put it, cut off his todger. According to witnesses, the man began clothed, and then he stripped naked and began bashing in windows and houses and cars. The police arrive at the scene, and he immediately charges at them, yelling, "Get out of here, bitch." In a rare occurrence, onlookers are yelling at the police to just shoot the guy. This time though, they actually managed to subdue him with a taser. He was taken into custody and it's unclear what happened to him after. There's another high-profile case like this though that actually gives us more insight into what happens after. On April of 2014, a Wu-Tang Clan affiliated rapper named Christbearer had reached a low point in his life. He was hit with restraining orders that would prevent him from being able to see his children. Needing a way to cope, he turns to drugs. He already had drug problems, but this situation just took him to the next level. And in an interview with Vice, he speaks about what happens next.
PCP is something that can alter reality. You can see something. It's like knowledge. You can see something, and once you see that, you can't never go back. It's like you can be exposed to too much truth, and it can make you nutty. So that night when I had some PCP, I was watching cartoons, and to me, for some reason, life turned into a cartoon. And I had 3 baby mothers, and I had restraining orders on me, so I can see my kids. But I figured, man, I keep on having these babies by these girls, and I was thinking they just got a groupies, and then once they have these babies by me, I'm trapped. And they say, hey, I'm gonna need this amount of money for you to be in their life. It started being like society that was just dragging me down into a vortex that I could not stop. Women say, men think with their little head too much. They always think with their little heads. So I said, you know what? I got something for these bitches. I'm gonna cut off my little head, and I'll be forced to only think with my big head. And that was clear as day to me, and I acted upon it.
Shortly after the incident, he also spoke to E about how in control he was. Yes, I was doing drugs that night, but I was in complete control, he said. I cut it off because that was the root of all my problems. My solution to the problem was the realization that sex is for mortals, and I am a god. Those kinds of activities got me into trouble, and I came here to be a god. After working with a psychiatrist following the incident, he came to realize that he had been dealing with severe depression. And like a lot of people, he was using drugs to mask his mental health issues. He also spoke about how he now felt that mental health issues aren't taken as seriously as they should be in the hip-hop community. In another interview with Vice, he also commented that his mental health was made worse by the media frenzy and mockery by celebrities he once admired. Specifically, he calls out Charlemagne. He also notes that although he was a Wu-Tang affiliated rapper, he was basically only known by fans of underground hip-hop, and then all of a sudden he's cast into the mainstream by these insane circumstances. Because of this, he laments that if it was this bad for him, it's probably even worse when things happen to mainstream celebrities. It was initially reported that doctors were unable to attach the part that was cut off, but later it was said that he underwent multiple procedures and did maintain some function. In a BBC documentary, he explained, "When I'm actually having the act of sex, it's not like, oh, I wish I still had my shit. It's like, I'm in there, like it used to be." In 2020, he would get married. And in speaking to TMZ, he noted that everything was in fact fully functional now. He also reflects on the incident once more. "I'm the only man who ever did what the FK I did, and I'm proud of it. Because why? In the annals of history, I don't think you got anybody who ever did it. I might have made the biggest mistake ever in history, but I'm proud of that. Clearly from this video, he's far from the only one, but he's definitely by far the one that's given us the most insight into the person's perspective. And as much as I'd like to end this video on that relatively positive note, I believe that I actually did find the exact story that traumatized me all those years before. It happened in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, all the way back in 2003. An unnamed 34-year-old man with mental health issues, and also a history of self-harm attempts, including stabbing himself in the head with a pair of scissors, had taken some kind of hallucinatory pills. Then one night, he wakes up with voices in his head. Not the Randy Orton style of voices telling him to RKO somebody out of nowhere. Instead, the voices are saying, cut your dick off. Who is he to doubt the voices? So he cuts it off. Then he wraps it up in a piece of cloth, and then he cooks it and eats it. Shockingly, he did survive this ordeal, although he would have permanent issues urinating. I actually came across a similar story in Japan, but this act was much more deliberate, done by a performance artist named Mao Sugiyama. Like the foot taco guy, he serves it to people, but there's actually a lot more to this story that it merits its own video, so I guess subscribe to see that one in the future. Let's talk about the Cars period blood incident, as in the movie Cars. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, there's a new jar. It honestly hadn't occurred to me before, but thinking about it now, I'm actually kind of surprised that there hasn't been anything else like this that I've covered exactly. In that, I mean a weird jar, but it's kept by a woman. I mean, I've heard stories about the women's bathroom before. Supposedly, you guys are nastier than the dudes, particularly when it comes to leaving period stuff all over the place. And one father on Reddit was not prepared to witness such a scene. He was horrified when he looked in his daughter's closet and found a menstrual blood-imbued monument to the movie Cars. This is the story of the tow truck mater period jar. On October 22nd of 2023, a throwaway account named Purple Limerence79 posts to a few different subreddits asking for advice. Found something nasty in my daughter's closet. Don't know how to react. Mods in r/advice and r/parenting deleted the posts, but it remained up in r/confessions where it got a lot of engagement. The poster, who was 43 years old, was cleaning his 17-year-old daughter's room. In the process of doing this, he notices a really bad smell. He follows the smell to its source, which leads him to the closet. He then discovers something that he claims is mystifying as a sheltered white dad in his 40s. Which really, who describes himself as a sheltered white dad? It makes it sound like it's some kind of offbeat sitcom. Or, something for some weird guy to fantasize about. Nevertheless, he finds that behind her clothes, she was hiding a filthy, disgusting mason jar containing a cast iron figure of the tow truck for the movie Cars mater. And he's not alone in there. He's covered in what he says appears to be 2 years worth of used tampons and period blood. Now, of course, Reddit being Reddit, they get really hung up on the 2 years estimate. Like, now you have discussions of the story being fake, which of course those would always come up, but it's not that it's fake because it's a crazy story on Reddit by an anonymous guy. It's fake because the numbers don't add up. You have some people actually doing the math where they're calculating a range, how many you could possibly produce in 2 years, with 144 tampons at the lower end and 520 tampons at the upper end, depending on how heavy or light this girl's periods are, and how well she observes the recommendation to not use one for more than 8 hours at a time. Like, realistically, if this story is true, it's not like he sat there and counted each tampon by hand. He just saw a lot of tampons and came up with a big number. Like, he's not trying to come up with an accurate estimate like he was counting jelly beans at a circus. And as a lot of people pointed out, this is a 40-year-old man. He's probably not the best versed on what is and isn't normal for tampon usage. You also had a poster who pointed out that because she was so athletic when she was younger, as we later learned that OP's daughter is, that she missed a lot of her periods growing up. But then if we're considering that, then we're coming up with a situation where the father is now factoring in how often her period actually occurs if it's abnormal. It's getting way more complicated than this would realistically be. As others in the comments suggested, this was likely something that happened for a relatively short amount of time, and then she just left it there because she didn't know how to dispose of it without getting caught. In any case though, the filth doesn't end here. In addition to the blood monument, there's drawings. Drawings of Mater with another truck, a female truck that kind of resembled his daughter. And they both have realistic human genitalia. So basically, the average DeviantArt user, and he's flabbergasted. I know this stuff is common on sites like 4chan, but my DD is not the type of to use those sites. She is popular, plays soccer, and was on the top of her class last year. Alright, yeah, popular, I'll give you that, although, you know, Taylor Swift uses 4chan, of course. But if I had to guess, I would expect the average school-age 4chan user to be someone who has better than average grades. Not because the website's educational, but because that's who winds up sitting on a site like that all day. Although, you know, realistically, this sort of filth has breached that containment decades ago. And we come to the reason why he's making this post. He doesn't want to tell his wife about it because he's afraid she's going to overreact because she has a very Christian background. He's worried that his daughter will get traumatized over stuff that he thinks is probably harmless teen stuff. School gets out in less than an hour, and I'm pretty sure she'll realize I've been snooping around. Please give the mortified dad a few pointers, please. In my day, the most we thought about sexy cartoons were a few giggles about Jessica Rabbit. And those definitely weren't things you'd hear a popular girl talk about. Is this common among the new generation of young? Obviously, the main reaction to this is people who think it's fake or an attempt at creating a new copy pasta. Which on some level, I think that's probably kinda worse. He came up with this fantasy scenario where his imaginary daughter is fantasizing about the tow truck from Cars, getting off to it, and this is all manifesting with her using her period blood to do it. Not the best thing to have just walking out there among us. But believe it or not, there actually was a surprising amount of decent, reasonable advice given in these threads. One user, Matt Jom, gave a little step-by-step on how to address the situation directly. I guarantee you that some of your peers in your day were doing more than giggling about Jessica Rabbit. Kink is not new, it's just not your thing. Your kid is almost an adult, and nothing you found is criminal or hurtful. Unfortunately, it is unhygienic, so you can't ignore it. When she comes home, ask her to sit down. Here's some talking points. I love you. I found the mason jar in your closet while cleaning. It's unsanitary and you can't keep it like that. Aside from the hygiene issue, it's not my business and I won't be sharing this information with anyone. But you have to deal with the hygiene problem. And since you're almost an adult now, you can start cleaning your own room. That's the deal. I'll respect your privacy if you respect our need for a clean and healthy home. If you break the deal, we'll have problems. Can you do that? I love you. Others had suggestions about how he could hint at it without being so direct. Yeah, that's a lot, OP. If you and your daughter have a strong bond, I suggest going for a drive and asking her about it. Not a bad idea. He could keep the car in reverse and say, "Shoot, I'm the world's best backwards driver. Just watch this right here." That, of course, being a quote from the character in the effigy. If I for some reason found myself in this situation in life, I would probably be inclined to go with this advice written by Flipper Gonzo. One of the earlier comments suggested that it's something that she grew out of but never found a way to get rid of. I wonder what would happen if you told her you cleaned her room but that you didn't have time to get to her closet. Let her know you're going to do that next week and give her the opportunity to get rid of it herself. If she gets rid of it herself, then you just have to kind of monitor and make sure she's okay. If she doesn't, then you know you have to start a conversation. I like the suggestion because it gives her the opportunity to deal with it on her own while still thinking her parents don't know about it. But Purple Limerence 79 would come back the next day with an update. He had completely ignored everybody's advice. After some considerations, I have decided to play it cool and not bring up the jar with my wife or daughter. I do not wish to shame my daughter for whatever kinks she may have as long as she kept it in her room, and I do not believe it is my wife's business. I am planning to buy some air fresheners and scented fragrance to put around the house. To avoid embarrassing anyone, I will simply say that I left some meat in the fridge too long. I will think about getting counseling for my daughter, but I don't want to stigmatize her or think something is wrong with her. Also, therapy is rather expensive in my area. If you have any tips on this, let me know. I hope I am being a good father. This is such an unsatisfying ending that it almost makes me think the story's real. As a number of users pointed out, you can't just leave that alone, it's a health risk. If you think back to my video about homemade fleshlight disasters, there was a case where someone had actually developed severe respiratory issues because of something like this. And here you are, putting your whole family and yourself at a risk just to avoid a difficult conversation. You even had one poster, RageMonkey91, who pointed out that she feels she's turned out to be a much better adult, specifically because her father was willing to have these kinds of difficult conversations with her. But ultimately, I think it was the user Third Dimensional Crisis that really got to the heart of the matter. Can you, make up a different ending? And that's the story of the tow truck mater period blood effigy. There's this screenshot from Craigslist that goes viral every once in a while. It's got a man in some sort of gimp costume floating around in brown liquid. And no, this is not Augustus Gloop from some gritty reboot of Willy Wonka. That is no chocolate river. That is the contents of a septic tank. I pay to enter your septic tank for an hour at a time. $150, Jacksonville, Alabama. Some might judge me for this, but it's what I enjoy. I will pay you $150 an hour to bring my equipment in and gain access to your septic tank. I then have my associate close the tank after I have set my tripod and camera up. Believe it or not, it's a great place to reflect. And he's all stanced up like that trade-offer meme. You receive $150, I receive poo water. So what's the deal with this guy anyway? Let's find out on this episode of Tales from the Internet. This story right here was actually suggested to me by Wavy Web Surf. I guess he figured this was more of a me story. I had actually looked into this back in the day and it didn't seem like there was much of a story there. I figured there wasn't enough lore to this for a whole video. Looking into it again, I was completely off. So the oldest version of this screenshot that I could find dated back to 2019. But the man shown here has been around a lot longer. Most popularly in a video referred to as Septic 5, which dates back to at least 2013. Septic 5 begins with a man turning on his camera before putting on his poopy glove. He backs up and sinks into the water, revealing his large body in a latex suit. He's wearing a gimp mask that almost looks like some kind of retro luchador gear, and then he takes a deep gaze into the camera before diving, bringing his head below the surface of the water. Then he comes back up above the surface, rubbing the filth all over himself. This goes on for nearly 3 minutes. This video, which surprisingly stayed up on YouTube for several years, became the subject of a lot of reaction videos. Popular ones include Your Mom's House and Mega 64. And now, the name Septic 5 implies Septic 1 through 4. And sure enough, there is another video. The earliest appearance of him that I could find was in January 2012 on the Documenting Reality forums. The one that's posted here is a completely different video with the same guy, but its contents are basically the same. And while I was not able to find Septic 2 through 4, I think we can all take a guess as to what those videos may be like. You've also got a sequel named Septic 6, but this one features a different guy, some type of old wizard-looking dude in dirty but not as dirty water. So who is the man under the mask? According to Google's AI, it's Rocco from Mega 64, who is a food influencer and was paid $5,000 for making this video.
I hate that I have to make a statement about this, but for the peace of mind of my family, my loved ones, and myself, I have to get this off my chest as soon as possible. I am not the man in the Septic 5 video. Google and its CEO have been spreading a false narrative that I'm the rubber suit shit swimmer. There is not a grain of truth to this narrative, and I want it to stop now. Every time the video is passed around, someone in my family asks if it's me, if it's true that I got in that septic tank and just submerged, that I just made soup, that I just swam and did a little doggy paddle in the shit stew, and it's false. If anyone ever calls me a rubber suit shit swimmer again, there will be severe consequences, the likes of which you have never seen. Do not contact me, do not reach out to me, and do not replicate or upload this video in any way or retweet me at any point. Thank you.
Some have pointed to a man named Mark Martin, but he's actually a completely different guy who did a very similar video. In this video, he also rolls around in poop water with the addition of touching himself as he does it, but his was framed as more of an art piece. Mark is a French artist whose mission, as he puts it, is to push the borders between public and private spaces. And in addition to his poop video, he's also made books and art exhibitions. But the name that I see associated the most with this guy is Gary Moody. Most sources seem to state that without a shadow of a doubt that the masked poop guy is Gary Moody. So, Gary Moody is a main man. When I say main man, I mean the guy from the state of Maine. I don't mean like, hey, my main man, Gary Moody, the poop guy. He's a main man who was arrested in New Hampshire in 2005. This arrest was made after he was found hiding in the chamber underneath a woman's outhouse in a park. He was caught by a 14-year-old girl after she went to the bathroom and saw her looking up at her through the toilet. Dude's a real-life ghoulie. So here's what he said happened. According to Gary, he had been changing his clothes in the women's outhouse because the men's was full. While he was changing his clothes, his wedding ring fell off and went into the toilet. So of course he had to climb into the whole toilet to get it. James Sunderland could never. Of course, when the park went through the system, there was no wedding ring to be found. Regardless though, Gary only received a 30-day suspended sentence, as long as he had 2 years of good behavior. And you know what, he did have 2 years of good behavior. But then in 2009, he was caught once again underneath a toilet in the same park. The smoking gun sums up this incident pretty well. According to an affidavit filed last week in U.S. District Court in Portland, a 9-year-old boy waiting to use the bathroom noticed that the toilet had been pulled out and was lying on the floor. At that point, a man popped out of the hole leading to the waste vault. After a few minutes, a completely wet man exited the restroom and told the boy, "Man, sorry about that. I was getting my shirt." After learning of the bizarre incident, federal investigators immediately suspected Moody had been in the vault based on the extremely rare nature of this type of activity. When interviewed at his home, Moody admitted climbing into the vault, claiming that his shirt had fallen into the waste chamber. Moody claimed that he had removed his shirt and placed it on the seat of the outhouse because he thinks that outhouse seats are dirty. Because you know, if outhouse seats are dirty, that's where you want to put your shirt. After being pressed by the police a bit more though, he would admit that he's actually done this a bunch of times where he wasn't caught. And now, like I said, I've often seen it taken for granted that Gary Moody is the septic tank man, but I've not seen a single piece of evidence for this. And frankly, I think it's extremely unlikely that it's him. For starters, the septic tank guy seems to just be in it for the pure joy of being in the sludge, whereas Gary was more of a peeping Tom. Furthermore, nothing in the reports talk about any kind of costume or any kind of recording gear. Perhaps he developed this all later on, as the videos do seem to be later than when he was arrested, but to me it just seems like he has completely different motivations. Gary is also not the only man who's been caught in such a scenario. In 2011, you have Luke Ivan Christgo of Boulder, Colorado. He was hiding in a toilet at a yoga festival and admitted to having a series of peepholes all around the city where he would watch women in the bathroom. Then in 2013, you have Kenneth Enslow, who was found in a toilet in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was caught looking at little girls through the toilet. And then he claimed that what really happened was his girlfriend knocked him out with a tire iron and put him down there. Of course, he had no such injuries to support that claim. So for all of these people who were caught in such a situation, it seems like it wasn't really about being in the poop sludge, it was about looking at mostly children. So as far as I'm concerned, the guy from Septic 5 is basically unidentified. I've seen it claimed that he used to go by the name Septic Man and had a whole channel dedicated to this, but I haven't been able to verify it or find any chatter online linking to it or anything like that. Although there was an unrelated movie in 2013 called Septic Man that features the wrestler Kurgan. There's also people who say that these videos are probably staged because he would have died had he done this for real. Their reasoning being that if not the disease that's carried in sewage water, then the fumes inside of the septic tank. And for that matter, I've seen it said that he did die, including one post referencing an older thread. IDK, but I think this guy died of some disease. I saw some post on a subreddit that said Septic 5 Man dead, and it was apparently a 15-year-old post, so I guess he got some disease from that shit he was sitting in. So that brings up an interesting question. If there actually was a man going inside people's septic tanks and floating around in it, would he actually be able to survive that? So once again, I asked real medical professional Chubby Emu for his thoughts. Wow, good question. All of this supposes that the septic tank hasn't been heavily treated with chemicals, and we're talking about a dude swimming in mostly just human waste. It depends. Does he have any cuts or breaks in his skin that could allow bacteria to get into his body? Is he immunocompromised somehow? Like from taking medicines or having an existing disease? Those two things could make a life or death difference. Hypothetically, at best he might feel a little ill afterwards, like the flu, if he isn't totally grossed out during the swim. At worst, the bacteria from the human waste gets into his bloodstream somehow and causes his immune system to overreact. That would cause sepsis, which can then become shock from blood vessels dilating, and then cause all his organs to fail because blood can't flow through any of them. The waste touching his butthole while he's swimming shouldn't cause that much of a problem, since the rectum and colon are meant to handle all of that. If he swallows some by accident, it's nasty to us, but so long as it stays in the GI tract and doesn't leak into the blood, probably isn't something that causes death. The addition of chemicals to the tank could change this a bit, depending on what those chemicals are. Honestly, when he puts it that way, it seems more survivable than I expected it to. And that's not me recommending that you go do this, although if you're the kind of person that would go do this, I don't think you would listen anyway. But then again, it could cause death depending on a lot of factors, so it's always a gamble. So once again, would not recommend it. But anyhow, that's the story of Septic Tank Man for now. One day in 2018, a high school teacher named Mark Mongiardo is driving home when he notices police sirens behind him. He's being pulled over. The cops suspect he's driving drunk. When he stops, the cops decide to give him a breathalyzer test. Of course, Mark hadn't been drinking at all, so this shouldn't be a problem. So he takes the test, and they find that he has a blood alcohol content of 0.18. In New York, where this happened, the legal limit is a 0.08. He explains to the cops that this has to be a mistake. He hadn't even had a single drink. But of course, the cops have heard this story a million times before. Mark gets a DWI. This time, he was only 3 weeks into a brand new job at a school. 6 months later, this would happen again. With pending felony charges, the school has no choice but to let him go. And subsequently, he was struggling to get any job at all. But he wasn't lying to the cops. He lost everything all because of a crime he legitimately didn't do. How could such a thing be possible? What if I told you there's a disease that makes you drunk without drinking? For today's video, let's take a look at auto brewery syndrome. There's this guessing game that you see people play sometimes. They had a few drinks and they're trying to figure out if enough time has passed if they'd be good to drive right now. I'm not saying you should do this, I'm saying it happens. But imagine if you had to do that every single time you got behind the wheel, whether you'd been drinking or not. The problem for Mark actually started all the way back in 2006, long before any run-ins with the cops. In an interview with ABC7, he speaks about how at the time, he was a teacher in New Jersey. People started to complain that he smelled like alcohol, but he insisted that he would never drink at work, especially because he worked at a school. But administrators kept getting complaints, and he could tell that despite repeated denials, nobody believed him. And why would they? I mean, you can catch an alcoholic red-handed and they'll deny up and down that they've done anything. Throughout his time teaching in New Jersey, the smell wasn't his only symptom either. In an interview with Today, he described some of the symptoms. I thought that there was something wrong with me. I wasn't exactly sure what. I just thought I was tired all the time. My wife has on numerous occasions said I wasn't acting right. Of course, though, there are other more obvious reasons why he might feel this way. For example, he was working 12-hour days. How couldn't he be exhausted? And at that time, he was pushing 40, so you can expect to just not have that same energy you used to have. But the exhaustion wasn't his only symptom. And eventually, even his wife began to suspect that he was lying. I had all the signs and symptoms of drinking even before she smelled me. So, for years, she thought I was hiding drinking, and I would come home each day and I would basically be drunk, he says. I had symptoms of being intoxicated, from slurring speech to balance issues, and this happened even at social events where I had not been drinking. But at this point, these things weren't happening as often as they eventually would. It was in 2012 that these symptoms began to really ramp up. He found himself speaking to administrators about his suspected alcoholism all the time, and he realized that he couldn't stay there. By no fault of his own, his reputation had been ruined. So he would leave to a different school district in upstate New York. Now he was working as an athletic director. Just 3 weeks into this new job, he's pulled over by the cops. And it wasn't even that he was driving erratically or anything like that. Basically what had happened was a car was reported for littering out the window on the road, and Mark's car just happened to resemble that car. Just a sheer stupid coincidence. Although it's not mentioned in any of the interviews he's done, I think it's likely that when the cops pulled him over for this, they, like a lot of his coworkers, probably smelled alcohol on him. And that's probably what prompted them to give him the breathalyzer, leading to this first DWI. And at this point, the school was actually willing to overlook it. The superintendent said, "You've done such a great job within the first 3 weeks of being an athletic director that we actually are willing to move past it." But 6 months later, it all happens again. This time he's pulled over and it's his own fault. They caught him on his phone while he's driving. Once again, they give him a breathalyzer test and once again he fails it. No matter how good he is at his job, the school can only look the other way so much. So he's placed on leave for the remainder of the school year and they don't renew his contract. He tells ABC what happened next. "That's when I lost everything. I lost everything that somebody could lose," he said. "I had to sell my house. I had to sell my car. I couldn't get a job in education. I couldn't get a job at a grocery store. I had pending felony charges. I was facing prison time for 2 DWIs when I had not been drinking." With his whole life falling apart and people around him suspecting that he's an alcoholic who's lying, it was actually his mother who cracked the case. All she did was think to Google if it's possible for someone's body to make alcohol itself, and it turns out it is. It's a condition known as auto-brewery syndrome. It's first identified in Japan in the 1970s. It's an exceptionally rare condition with less than 100 documented cases worldwide. Basically what happens is you get this bacteria or fungi in your gut. Then when you eat carbohydrates, these colonies in your gut cause them to ferment, creating alcohol. And now that this alcohol is in your body, it must be digested, so your body makes itself drunk. Apparently, there's also a similar condition in which this process happens in your bladder. I can only imagine that this is how they make Keystone Light. There's a wide variety of risk factors that can increase your chances of getting this. It's been connected to Crohn's disease and diabetes and some other conditions. But it seems to most often come as the result of treatment with antibiotics. We take antibiotics to kill off a bacterial infection, but it doesn't just kill the bad bacteria. It'll also kill off some of the good bacteria in our bodies that keeps these other things in check. And in some people's bodies, when this good bacteria is killed off, it allows all these other things to run rampant. Such was the case of a man named Donato Giannotto, whose story made the news several years before Mark's. After having what should have been a very simple procedure on his nose, Donato began to experience symptoms very similar to Mark's, notably exhaustion and slurred speech. Then one night after dinner, he would suffer from a seizure. When his wife Michelle brought him to the hospital, she was told that he was experiencing alcohol withdrawal, which made no sense because he hadn't had a single drink in years. So with no idea what was going on, Giannotto's wife was left to hopelessly watch him fall apart after what should have been a very simple routine procedure. They struggled with this for nearly 2 years until a cousin who was a doctor suggested auto-brewery syndrome. They tested him for it, and sure enough, the cousin's suspicion was correct. So here's how the test works. Basically, they'll monitor your blood alcohol levels as they feed you more and more non-alcoholic carbs. If that level increases, you have auto-brewery syndrome. Michelle noted her observations when speaking to New York One. He would not show symptoms until it went a little bit higher. So my theory is that he was brewing alcohol for so long that he was becoming tolerant. But the condition was so rare that even though they had diagnosed it, they had no idea how to treat it. His condition kept worsening and he kept having more seizures. She described a moment of desperation to CBC Radio. I called my husband's endocrinologist crying one day and begged for help. And I said, "Please find me a doctor. He's going to die. I don't want to bury him." The endocrinologist said, "Let me make some phone calls. I'll call you back," she said. Eventually, the endocrinologist referred her to a doctor in Staten Island, Dr. Prasanna Wickramasinghe. Although at that point he had never had a patient with the condition, he had heard of it and was interested in studying it. The doctor collected samples from Donato to determine which microbes were causing his condition. He then prescribed antifungal medicine to kill them off. This treatment, combined with a no-carb diet and probiotics, would help restore the gut's natural levels and effectively end the auto-brewery syndrome. Unfortunately, Donato would ultimately pass away in 2020, but his wife Michelle would continue to provide help for people dealing with this very rare condition. Since Donato's treatment, Dr. Wickramasinghe would go on to become one of the world's leading experts in this condition, treating over 30 patients including Mark Mongiardo. And it was with the doctor's treatment that Mark would finally begin to get his life back, although it wasn't without its challenges. I come from an Italian-American family. I haven't had pasta or pizza or anything like that since I was diagnosed in May 2019. It was extremely challenging in the beginning. Of course, it is possible for some people to eventually return to a completely normal diet, as was the case with a North Carolina man who, like Mark, got a DWI because of the auto-brewery syndrome, but now says he eats pizza and pasta with no problem. But the doctor warned that sometimes people will relapse after another antibiotic treatment or some kind of other trigger event. And it can also have much more serious health implications. There's the case of Sarah Lefevre of Connecticut. Sarah had been dealing with the condition for at least 15 years without having any idea what was going on with her. The seriousness of it wasn't realized until her 23rd birthday. It was extremely cold outside and her friend dropped her off at home. Before she could get inside her house, she passed out in the cold. She had had some drinks that night, but nowhere near enough to cause this to happen. And throughout the years, she would often pass out like this, on some occasions breaking bones. The diagnosis didn't occur until she was already suffering from liver failure more than a decade later. She needed a liver transplant, but at the same time, they couldn't give her a liver transplant until his condition was controlled. And the conventional antifungal treatments weren't working for her. Although there were glimmers of hope with more powerful antifungal treatments, it was too little too late, and Sarah would eventually pass in July of 2023. all because her condition went untreated for so long because it's a thing that people don't even think could happen. And if you do think of it, it's the thing that sounds like you're an alcoholic and you're lying. And one of the concerns raised by Dr. Wickramasinghe is it being believed in courts. Although Mark's DWIs were thrown out due to prosecutors not prosecuting him in time, and there are cases for autobrewery syndrome being accepted in court, such as the case of a woman charged with a DWI in upstate New York, there's also been cases where the judge rejected the diagnosis and gave out jail time. This happened to 2 of the doctor's patients, one in Indiana who was given 6 months of jail time, and another in Ohio who was given 2 years. All that being said, if anything I'm describing in this video sounds familiar to you, it's probably worth looking into. I suspect that this condition is far more common than people realize, because like I just said, it's not something that even occurs to people. And also it seems like a lot of the patients who get the diagnosis are geographically close to the one guy that's an expert on it. So there's probably been some people with the condition who went to doctors who just didn't know about it. But in any case, that's all for now. I made a short a while back about a girl who had a bit of a gross misadventure with a pool toy. A very stinky misadventure. And a lot of the comments that I got on that post seem to reflect the fact that normally this is something that happens to guys. Often in even more gross and horrifying ways. And they were right. I mean, just look at the coconut story that I covered a while back. But really, that story is just scratching the surface. There's so many more of these. And a lot of them have much more severe consequences. And I warn you, some of the tales in this video are gonna have you uncomfortably crossing your legs. For today's video, let's take a look at some online misadventures with improvised pocket kitties. Before I really get into this video, I just want to talk about how, you know how in the first 15 to 30 seconds of a video, you have to keep it extra G-rated or else YouTube is just gonna bury the video and demonetize and all that crap. So the way I get around it is I gotta come up with euphemisms for things. So I'm like, what's a good euphemism for a fleshlight? And I'm coming up with nothing at first. So I look it up and the things that they're giving me, Alabama egg roll, Fleshkimo brothers. To me that sounds more like if you and your friend are sharing the same one. Probably my favorite one that I saw was Greenpeace Hot Pocket, which to me sounds more like a Hot Pocket that's vegan, and I'm not sure you get what that is technically vegan. In any case, I wasn't really satisfied with any of those, and then I pulled pocket kitties out of my ass. But anyway, here are some stories of homemade toys gone horribly, horribly wrong. Our first story is like something out of Silent Hill, specifically Silent Hill 4, if you know what I mean. TIFU by mostly circumcising myself with a drill and a pool noodle. How do you circumcise yourself with a drill? I'm picturing someone, you know, like doing the fork and spaghetti type deal. Anyway, this is a throwaway account because his friends know his real Reddit account. He talks about the birthday he had the year before making this post. This was a depressing birthday for him as he had nobody to spend it with. All of his friends were too busy to do anything, and to that experience made him officially feel like he had reached adulthood. He had also been single for about a year, so he was feeling particularly lonely. So he decides that he's gonna celebrate this birthday by himself with what he describes as an extra special masturbation experience. Starts to look around his house for ideas. It makes me think about how back in the day, people used to wind up on this website called Jackin' World. It's actually still there in its original form, that beautiful 90s web design. This site would have you come up with all kinds of crazy contraptions, like things with sandwich bags, couches, banana peels. But this guy didn't have that, he just MacGyvered something up on his own, tinkering in his basement like a little Thomas Edison. Here's what he comes up with. He cuts off a section from an old pool noodle. I have no idea why this always comes back to the pool toys. Stuffs the noodle with a microfiber cloth, and using a needle and thread he winds up fixing it to the inside of the pool noodle. He then lubes up the inside, puts on a condom, as he says for extra smoothness, and he just goes to town. The idea of using a cloth, any cloth, even a microfiber cloth, sounds like a terrible idea, but that wasn't a problem. He said it was actually really good. But then as he's finishing up his special experience, he notices, at the other side of his apartment, his power drill. I guess on some level, I can understand the compulsion to want to use it. I mean, you get that, like, that little, like, twisty motion, right? But you would never in a million years see me put my junk next to anything that could generate that sort of power. But I guess this guy was just braver than I am. So what he does is he puts toilet paper in one end of the tube, shoves the paper into the drill chuck, and then puts the pool noodle back onto himself. It starts spinning, and he says it feels amazing. But it felt a little too good. So good that he kinda loses himself in the moment. And as he starts nutting, he pushes himself further into the tube. Feels fine, but then as he pulls back, he notices that he's stuck in the drill chuck. Specifically, his foreskin is caught in there. He takes his finger off the trigger immediately and tries to get it out, but it's stuck. And while he's trying to free himself from the drill, he's still getting those, like, you know, those, like, little, like, aftershock nut putters. So he's trapped in the drill and still nutting, very reluctantly, as he puts it. He compares it to if you had finished watching your favorite video and then all of a sudden it switches to Ron Jeremy. And then he describes his mission to save his foreskin. I could feel that my foreskin was still somewhat attached, and I didn't want that to change. So I put on my baggiest pair of pants. That's why you should always have a pair of Jenkos ready. I put on my baggiest pair of pants and drove to Emerge. I told them exactly what happened in front of a young woman, family of 5, and an old Indian couple. It was definitely the most embarrassing experience of my life. Although he doesn't remember much of it, he says that the surgery was a success. He just couldn't touch himself for a few weeks, and that wound up being the worst birthday of his life. You got people in the comments asking him to show the surgery scar, but he's afraid that in the future someone might see his dick and then recognize him from the Reddit post. Of course, this being Reddit also leads to a massive discourse about circumcision. You got a guy in there who's actively trying to regrow his foreskin by stretching it. You got a guy in there that's adamant that it's better to be circumcised, and it gets a little heated in the thread. But ultimately, the poster was satisfied in his decision to keep his. The next story also involves foreskin destruction. C. Bugger writes, TIFU by ripping my foreskin apart with a ceiling fan. I just immediately get this image in my head of, do you remember that episode of The Simpsons where Bart steals Grandpa's dentures and he puts them in his mouth and bites onto the ceiling fan and swings around? I'm just imagining that with this guy in his foreskin. Although, you know, he would have had to be a really little guy for it to not pull it out of the ceiling. He begins by saying that this story took place 20 years ago when he was 16. This, of course, was before he was online, so he had to get a little creative sometimes. One day, his mother goes to the store, and that's when he comes up with his invention. He takes a toilet paper roll, fills it with wet toilet paper, and then duct tapes it to his wiener. I had to reread it several times to make sure that he said he taped it to his wiener and not just, you know, to itself. Because there's just no way that anyone who has ever felt duct tape would have ever made that decision. But that's not even where the main problem comes in. After he makes sure that the roll is really tight, he makes a rope out of more duct tape and wraps it around one of the blades of the ceiling fan. At this point, the way he's describing it, it sounds like he's just gonna rip his whole damn dick off. Like, this sounds like a deleted Mortal Kombat fatality. But in his mind, here's what's going to happen. When he sits on one side of the ceiling fan, the spinning motion is going to pull and release the tube as it gets closer and further away, thus creating some kind of up and down motion. I've played The Incredible Machine enough to know that the physics don't always work how you think they're gonna work. And this certainly did not work how he thought it was going to work. All starts well as I sit on a desk chair below the fan. A bit slow, but working, so I turn it up. I start to notice that since there is no swivel, the duct tape is twisting and shortening. It's pulling violently on my pubes and skin. I can't get the fucking thing off. I stand up to buy myself time, shut off the fan, pull the string and wait. Oh fuck, still going. I'm on my tippy toes and my pubes are ripping. I pull the string and the fan begins to slow, but it's still twisting. I slam my hand into the fan to stop it. The fan breaks out of the ceiling, but I'm free. He removes himself from the device and finds that he's now got a fistful of pubes. And he discovers that he had basically given himself a penile Indian burn, with tears in his foreskin and spots of blood. And his head is a color that he describes as ghostly gray, a color that gradually transforms into purple over the course of the next day. And then all of his skin would molt over the course of the next 3 weeks. To this day, he says he still has a long white scar down his shaft that has no feeling. And yet now, at the age of 36, he says that he thinks the idea still has potential. It all would have worked if he had a swivel. But I mean, there's no need. I feel like we've gotten beyond that technologically now. I mean, the Chinese invented that suck machine. I don't know what there's a proper name for it, but it's the suck machine. Our last story comes from Catatree Does Games, simply entitled My Fleshlight Horror Story. Like the story before, this disaster was born out of a need to get off extra good without his parents knowing. But unlike the previous stories, this guy grew up with the internet, so he had access to advanced knowledge. Specifically, his friends sent him schematics for a homemade fleshlight. He goes on to explain to the readers what a fleshlight is, as if anybody reading this story wouldn't know. But he then says that he assumes everyone reading this knows about the 2 sponges, rubber glove, and cup method. I'm stumped. 2 sponges, rubber glove, and cup. Okay, that makes sense. Mr. Bean did not say that. In any case, Catatry, a self-described clever guy, wants to level this up a bit. He takes a brick of memory foam, drills a hole into it, then stuffs it with a kitchen glove, and he tightens this device at key points with rubber bands to create a variety of experiences. Then he secures the whole thing with duct tape to a mason jar. What he's describing here, it almost sounds like one of those Tenga devices with different pressure points and little doodad. And he said the experience with this thing was mind-blowing. So good that he used it for 6 months straight, at least 2 days a week, sometimes 3. Every time he used it, he'd fill it with lotion. And although he would try not to, sometimes he would nut into it and eventually just stop caring and did it every time. But he thought it was okay because, you know, it all disappeared every time he did it. I hope you understand. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. Eventually, though, he starts getting bored of it, starts using it less, and eventually forgets about it entirely. He puts it away in a small chest in the back of his shelf, where it stays for 3 years. But then one day, he comes home and found that his mom got new furniture, and everything on that shelf was gone, either moved onto his bed or put in a box. That is, everything except for one object. She had taken it out of the chest it was in, maybe just to give me the message that she knew what it was. I was absolutely fucking mortified. I decided that, for whatever reason, I was not going to move the fleshlight anywhere else. I guess I thought that if I didn't acknowledge it, nothing would come of the situation, or at least I would give the impression that I didn't know where it was or that it wasn't a fleshlight at all. But come on, my mom isn't that stupid. But when the furniture guys get there, his mother puts it into the chest and moves it. Crisis averted? Not really. In fact, this might have actually made things worse. The same year, he begins developing some kind of severe chronic breathing problem, but only when he laid down in his room. The symptoms were consistent with some kind of allergy, but he couldn't pinpoint it. He had dogs, but they never bothered him really during most of the day. But whatever it was literally getting so bad that he couldn't sleep at night, and as a consequence, he was exhausted every single day. But with no solution, he just toughed it out for more than a year. And that brings us to 2 weeks before he made this post. He's looking around at his room and he just happens upon Old Reliable. He was pleasantly surprised, like meeting an old friend. Nobody's home, so he thinks, hey, you know what, let's give it another go. By this point, though, he had forgotten his usual routine. 6 years had passed since he had begun using this, and it still looks fine from the outside. He just shoves himself in without any lotion or anything. But despite the lack of lotion, it's wet. He pulls himself out of it and discovers that his member is covered in some kind of black tar. An extremely stinky black tar. This is the Venom origin story that they don't want you to know about. He compared the smell to cheap Chinese takeout that had been left to collect mold over 8 months. Which is such a specific comparison that I feel like he probably had that happen as well. The smell was so bad that he just threw up immediately. Runs to the bathroom and cleans himself off. And now that he's finally clean, there's one thing left to do. You gotta take a look inside. You gotta find out what we're dealing with here. You gotta know the extent of the corruption. So he covers his nose, pulls out the old kitchen glove, and here's what he finds. In The Last of Us, there are times where entire walls will be covered in a thick pink growth of spores and fungal material. I shit you not when I say that it looked identical to what I saw on the inside of that glove. What was obvious to me now that, for whatever reason, was not obvious in 8th grade was that after using a fleshlight, the 3 pumps of lotion and cum you dump in it does not just disappear, it stays there. Pushed deeply into each of the 5 fingers of this glove was a thick black and white spotted mud, which, I'm not joking about this, had eaten 100 or so tiny holes through the glove. Turning it inside out and running it under the tap, the water turned dark brown as I washed the 6 years of moldy cum off my poor mother's kitchen glove. The smell did not leave my bedroom nor the bathroom for 2 days. My mother had made a comment about it upon coming home. I don't think she knew what it was. Obviously, I decided to throw the glove in the trash, which I hid in the very bottom of our trash can. 3 days after he got rid of this glove, his breathing problems disappeared. The man was dying of cum poisoning. But I feel that anyone who's watched this channel before, you knew exactly where this was going as soon as he said the lotion and cum disappeared. The ability to feel no pain sounds like some kind of superpower, and in some instances, it could be. Take, for example, the case of Olivia Farnsworth. Olivia is a child from Huddersfield in the UK who's been dubbed the Bionic Girl. She's earned this name because of a condition she has called chromosome 6 deletion. This condition causes her to not feel pain as well as hunger or fatigue. She became international news at the age of 7 when she was hit by a car and dragged for several feet. And then she just got up and walked away as if nothing had happened, totally nonchalant while her family's screaming. And upon examination, it turned out that she had no internal injuries whatsoever, just damage to her skin. Doctors theorized that because she never felt pain, she didn't have the instinct to tense up in that situation, and that's ultimately what saved her from having any internal injuries. The drawback is that because she's never experienced pain, she doesn't have the natural aversion to dangerous situations that a lot of people would otherwise have. And now, while Olivia is the only known person who experiences a lack of pain due to chromosome 6 deletion, there are other conditions that can cause it. For example, you have the case of Gabby Gingrass from Big Lake, Minnesota. She suffers from a condition called hereditary sensory and autonomic neuropathy type 5, which also causes you to feel no pain. Her story's been covered for over a decade by various news outlets and shows like Montel, Maury, and Oprah, and it provides an insight into the dangers of living without pain. So for today's episode, let's take a closer look. Patrick Swayze famously said in the movie Roadhouse,
"Pain don't hurt."
and he was right. It's really just a matter of perception, and the stuff in our brain that tells us that pain hurts. And the problem is, that perception is actually helpful a lot of the time. You got the old hot stove rule. As a kid, you touch a hot stove and you learn not to touch it because it hurts. But what if it didn't? In 2004, Gabby Gingrass's parents spoke to Care 11 in Minnesota about their daughter's condition. They would notice her fall down hard, but not really react and just get up and keep going, and she never cried. And note that never crying was also a symptom that Olivia's parents had mentioned. But that sort of thing, maybe you're better off without it. Here's where you're not better off though. They also noticed that Gabby was scratching at her own face, and when her teeth came in, she began to chew at her own hands. As her mother described it,
she is severely gnawing on her hands. And when the teeth come through, even just a little bit, biting, so they look like raw hamburger.
Eventually, she would destroy most of her teeth altogether by chewing too hard on toys, as well as her own tongue. She chewed up her own tongue so badly that she had to be brought in for surgery in which what remained of her teeth were removed. She had also injured her eyes by scratching at them, so they were literally sewn shut to protect them. Unfortunately though, that was too little too late, and her left eye had to be removed, and only limited revision remained in her right eye. Her father would later come up with the idea of equipping her with the goggles she's seen wearing in the Care 11 report. Since she had these procedures, she would also suffer from a broken jaw, as well as second-degree burns from a humidifier. Her parents were at a complete loss for what to do. But they were also determined to do whatever they had to ensure a happy future for their daughter. They made appearances on Oprah and Montel to bring awareness to their situation and the condition in general. They'd also start a charity called Gift of Pain to raise funds, but also to act as a support group for other families dealing with this condition. By that time, they had found out about just 25 other cases. In 2005, Gabby was one of 3 girls followed for Melody Gilbert's documentary entitled A Life Without Pain. And in 2011, Care News would connect with the family once again to see how Gabby was doing. By this time, the Gingrass family had been in contact with 60 families dealing with the condition, in large part due to media coverage as well as their Facebook page. They noticed one of the comments on the page while Care 11 was filming. "Hun, I have to read you one," says Trish to Steve as she reads a new posting from another mom. "I can't believe I'm actually grateful my daughter cannot feel the bite and bruise created when another child bit her arm on the bus." As they told it, the future for Gabby was looking brighter than they ever expected. In addition to their newfound support system, there were now surgeries that could possibly improve her vision. She would also be a candidate for dental implants when she turned 16. A follow-up interview with Oprah in 2014 would echo a lot of the same optimistic outlook, highlighting some of the accomplishments she made that her parents worried wouldn't be possible, although it also cataloged new injuries, such as when she broke her back without realizing it, as she also spoke a bit about the difficulties of dealing with other kids at school. Around this time, they also made a new website for their charity and posted this message: "Making a difference. A Gift of Pain Incorporated has truly made a difference in people's lives. Not long ago, a mother called us out of the blue and told us that either her or her and her child would not be alive today if it was not for this group. That really is all of you. Thinking about it now, I should have shared it with the group, but it was such a personal, tear-filled moment. A few things that we have learned since we began this eventful journey are that there are several reasons why someone may be affected by insensitivity to pain. Additionally, it affects everyone differently. Some people are high functioning, while at the same time other people are physically or cognitively impaired. We don't care. We welcome them all and help everyone that we can. When I say we, I mean the whole foundation. Everyone. We all help each other. We are the only people in the world who can. No one else knows this condition better than any other group of people in the world. Think of what we have accomplished together. No longer is this condition unknown. As a group, we have had a tremendous amount of publicity. People now say they have heard of the condition. Doctors are no longer unbelieving when you explain it to them. Police no longer take our kids away because they get hurt in unusual ways. We have over 80 members. 13 years ago, we were excited to find even one other family that we could share ideas with. We have a special camp that is dedicated to our kids, so they can try to have a normal camp experience. We care about all of you, and we are dedicated to keeping this group a sanctuary for all the families who are affected by insensitivity to pain. And then 2018 comes along. Gabby was finally old enough for the dental surgery she had waited so long for. She'll be able to eat meat, fruit, vegetables, all the stuff that everyone else takes for granted that she had never actually been able to properly experience. Her surgeons had intended to build her a new jaw from pieces of her hip bones, then attach her new teeth to the new jaw. But then, her insurance company, Aetna, would put a stop to that. According to a letter her family received, Aetna wouldn't pay for the procedures because they only pay for, as they put it, procedures that they deem necessary. So basically they're saying, yeah, sure, just eat baby food for the rest of your life. You'll be fine. In an interview with Care 11, her parents elaborate that this procedure is the only option for her. Because of the damage that's been done to her mouth, she can't have dentures. And her father questions whether they just don't understand that this isn't her fault. It's not because she didn't brush her teeth that her mouth doesn't work right. It's not because of anything she did, smoke crack or anything like that, to end up with the mouth she has. It's a condition that she has that is unavoidable, and we're asking them to step up and do what they're supposed to do. The station would reach out to Aetna and they would respond. They would now say that the family's plan doesn't include dental, which, if true, makes it strange that they didn't say that in the letter. They said that it wasn't a necessary procedure. It makes it seem as though this is something they only realized after they had already made the decision to not pay for the procedure. So they would have found a way around it regardless. Because, insurance companies only profit if they don't give you what you paid for. And in the interview with Care 11, she shares a photo shoot she did wearing a set of false teeth. 2 GoFundMes were opened to try to raise the funds for the procedure, but at around $100,000, it was a tall order, and it seemed to be falling short of the goal. And at that point, the insurance company seemed unmoved by the press coverage. However, Gabby would get her teeth. Delta Dental of Minnesota would pledge to donate up to $100,000 to the procedure. When he spoke to Care 11, their CEO Rodney Young said,
"The reason we did it is because it's the right thing to do."
The combined GoFundMes at that point raised about $45,000, and the Minnesota Dental Association pledged $5,000 as well. Ultimately, Aetna would actually come around and pay some of the money. After further review of Ms. Gingrass's unique circumstances and available plan benefits, we have determined that portions of the procedure, such as anesthesia and operating room services, are covered under the member's medical plan. We were happy to share this with the Gingrass family last week. Steve Gingrass said the Aetna payment will cover a few $1,000s of the total cost of his daughter's 3-stage procedure. He remains insistent that complex dental procedures should be covered by medical insurance. Her surgery would be scheduled for that July. So what actually got me started working on this video, I was in bed, it's like the sickest I had been in years. I had this weird headache where it was just like stabbing in my ears and the top of my head, like every 10 seconds. Like no Tylenol, like nothing helped. I literally couldn't record a video because I would like spasm mid-sentence. And I thought to myself, man, I wish I just couldn't feel pain. And I started to remember these stories. Now that I've read more about them, no I don't. Anyway, as of me recording this video, I was unable to verify whether or not the Gift of Pain charity is still active, but I know for sure I'll leave a comment one way or the other. That being said, you should also know that the girl I spoke about at the beginning of the video, Olivia, has worked with a charity called Unique, a group in the UK that provides support to people with rare chromosome disorders. 48 hours in the making. The beginning of the beginning. What you see here is a container full of what makes me, me. These were the words posted on January 18th of 2008 by a man calling himself Future's father. He was describing a jar containing his bodily fluids. What appears to be a small amount of liquid colored cough medicine pink. A jar whose contents he'd give a name. Adam. Now, you've heard about a lot of fluid-filled jars on this channel, but while those were all someone's secret shame, this one was a man's pride and joy. A science experiment that he thought of as a son. A jar that he was eager to share with the world, or at least with 4chan posters based on some of the comments his blog received. And unlike other stories like his, where people were surprised that they had accidentally created life, his goal was to create life. Like Lisa Simpson if she was on image boards. Would he succeed at creating miniature Lutherans? Let's find out in today's episode of Tales from the Internet. A few years ago on YouTube, homunculus egg experiments were all the rage. You would have these dudes that would inject semen into chicken eggs and whatnot. Perhaps the most infamous of these being the Russian homunculus experiment, which I might cover at some point on the channel, so subscribe and hit notifications. But this experiment right here went down in relative obscurity, nearly a decade before the trend. Not for clicks, just for love of the game. In the initial unveiling post, Future's father marks the date of Adam's creation as January 19th, 2008. And he promises to provide regular updates on Adam's progress. Although he admits that in those first 48 hours, there was no progress. Rome wasn't built in a day. He also admits that he has no idea what to expect from this, so he's as much along for the ride as we are. But judging by the solved Rubik's Cube sandwiched between Adam and a jar of Vaseline, this is a very scientifically minded individual. As he puts it, the philosophical and existential implications of my little project are numerous. He also invites people to comment with suggestions on how we can improve the project, and a small amount of suggestions would come through. People wanted him to add things like strands of hair, scabs, Gatorade so, Adam gets the electrolytes he needs, using a straw for air, or shooting electricity into it like Frankenstein. You also had one commenter who laid out why this would not do anything at all. I don't know what you're trying to accomplish. The semen will die in the blood because, sperm don't live in blood. They will also die after 1 to 2 days due to the fact that sperm cannot divide without an egg. And why even use blood? Use Dolbeck's medium. Dolbeck's medium being a substance used for cell cultures in labs. It's much better at providing nutrients. But like I said, the point of nutrients is moot since the sperm won't divide. It is genetically impossible. Maybe if you can get a girl to help out. That's a great opening line right there. Hey babe, you want to help me create life with a jar filled with blood and semen? And like the other guy said, bacteria/fungus are going to get into your concoction through the air, and it's gonna start smelling funky and looking weird. And although the readers knew that this jar contained Future's father's bodily fluids, they didn't know what the exact makeup of it was. So we'd have to explain in a subsequent post. As of right now, Adam consists of the following: several teaspoons of blood and semen, one hair with its root still intact, and a bit of mucus, all inside a sealed container which is kept between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I supply the container with fresh blood whenever I'm able and introduce new sperm into the mixture as often as possible. In the near future, I plan to set up some sort of ventilation for Adam. The easiest method was suggested to me earlier, and that would be a straw going down into the container through the cover, to give Adam fresh air without worrying about combating evaporation. As for what his actual goal with this was, he just wanted to create some sort of life. Ideally, he was hoping for something unique and interesting to form, some kind of creature. But realistically, he'd have been content with just a little bit of mold, which, as you may have seen on this channel before, it's a pretty likely outcome. The reason why he chose to use blood and semen was that he felt that these were the substances that most contained his essence. And he wanted to avoid using waste products like, pee and poo, because he thought that the bacteria they'd introduce would ruin the experiment. I'm sure you have some idea of how he may have collected the semen, but there's a lot of different ways you can collect blood. And he didn't want to cut himself for this experiment, which is honestly kind of surprising, because with this kind of thing, there's always like a little bit of a magical aura. It almost seems like the experiment would lend itself to pricking a finger or something. Instead, what he would do is sterilize his mouth with hydrogen peroxide, alcohol, and hot water. Then he would aggressively floss until his gums were bleeding, and just spit that mix into the jar. A few readers expressed concern that the mix of hydrogen peroxide and alcohol could bring harm to Adam, but Future's father thought that this might actually help prevent the jar from getting too gross. Some readers also suggested introducing a female egg to the mix, which, that stuff's kind of expensive. And also, he said that he didn't want to risk creating a human, which I can just picture in a situation like this. You make a little human, and it comes out looking like one of the Bliblies from Smiling Friends. But after getting some sleep, Future's father woke up to a disturbing discovery. Adam had been evaporating. You see, knowing that living things need oxygen to survive, he left Adam uncovered. But he knew that he needed a better way or Adam would simply vanish. So he wound up taking the earlier user suggestion and using a plastic straw through a hole for ventilation. He also made a bit of a discovery in Adam's evolution. It's hard to see in pictures, and I did my best to capture it, but it looks like an opaque cloud is beginning to form around the little blob of mucus in the center of the container. It could just be remnants of my saliva or semen, but I'd at least like to think for a while that there could be some sort of protein forming, using the mucus as a nucleus. Most notably, the single hair had attached itself to this nucleus. He also floats the idea of adding earwax to the concoction, and he's got this big picture of earwax that you just know that was real satisfying to get out. And he says that earwax has these antibacterial and antifungal properties that might help Adam. Some commenters suggested that it might actually have the opposite effect, while others say he's going to have to use just a little amount. With all these different ideas of what may or may not happen, some commenters were suggesting that he should do a bunch of different jars with different mixes of stuff to see how they turn out. But you know, there's only so much blood and semen one man can extract by himself. Day 5 comes around and now he has a microscope. But it only has up to 75 times magnification, and you need at least 400 times to see sperm cells, so he's probably not gonna see that much. But in any case, he's gonna wait a bit before putting it under the microscope. In the meantime, he's added more semen and blood, and the nucleus appears to have vanished. He asked the readers about this observation that he's made. I find it curious that everything I put into the mixture retains its shape and color for quite some time. After several hours, the whole mixture is once again homogenized and one element is not discernible from another within the translucent orange goulash. Is this an indicator of the development of life? Is it safe to assume that something living is absorbing the different substances? Or is it simply the result of several liquids being combined into one? Which, yeah, I would assume that would be what would happen eventually when you just mix a bunch of different liquids. Unless, you know, either your blood or semen were particularly oily, in which case you should probably be more concerned with your own health rather than the health of a jar of fluids. Or, you know, maybe you're just Greek or Italian or something, I don't know. The next day, however, this observation would be proven to be a false alarm, as he found the blood was pooling at the bottom of the container. It was at this point that he decided he should just leave it alone for a few days. And he would write an update at the end of the first week. Within Adam's first week of development, I've seen lots of changes. The most notable change is the volume of the mixture. Little by little, Adam's volume is growing, and that's just how I expect the developments to introduce themselves to me. If you consider organic growth, it is a very slow process. Maybe slow isn't the right word. Deliberate and subtle more accurately describe the way in which things develop naturally over time. Consider how long it takes to grow your hair out, or to grow it all. From day to day, you don't notice many changes. This is the same reason why a human fetus's growth is recorded in terms of weeks or months rather than days. These small changes translate to an infinitesimal daily growth. I'm not making excuses for Adam's apparent lack of development. I'm merely trying to explain why it may seem like nothing is changing. These things take time, and since I intend to let Adam grow with a minimal amount of human interference, it may take a lot of time. All I'm asking from you, as a reader, is to be patient and try to stay curious, because it is becoming quite clear that this experiment is going to take a long time to yield any worthwhile results. I intend to continue with what I'm doing for at least 9 months, and I'll continue past that if I feel that I should. He also notes that the individual pieces of the mixture had once again separated to some degree, with the mucus nucleus again becoming apparent, although its one strand of hair had fallen out. Damn, I should have gotten a Keep sponsorship for this video. He likens the separation of the blood, cum, and mucus into their own individual pieces to the development of organelles in primitive life forms. In any case, he realizes that it's a slow process, so updates will come less frequently. The next post would come on day 13. The biggest changes at this point would be that the strand of hair had completely dissolved, and he began to observe the formation of what he would call a structure in the blood, which was suspended inside the semen and was attached to the mucus nucleus. I'm not quite seeing what I'd call a structure here, but you can see it separating into different sections. Kinda reminds me of eye surgery or something. In any case, if there's no major changes soon, he's ready to introduce something new, potentially earwax. He also notes that the semen seems to devolve into the mix remarkably fast. To demonstrate this, he provides images documenting a 3-minute time lapse of the semen melting into the jar, like that picture of the chocolate gorilla melting into the milk. He also finally tried out his 75 times magnification microscope, and he saw nothing. Although he remains dedicated to seeing this experiment through to the end, you can kinda see his excitement about it dwindling a little bit here, as he jokes about adding caffeine to speed things up. But the next post is probably my favorite of this entire journey. Adam's 1-month birthday party. He even got balloons, a cupcake with a candle, and he made a little birthday hat. But aside from the birthday party, this post also marks the most noticeable changes since the beginning of the experiment. The mixture had now fully homogenized and thickened into what he described as a colloidal substance. He also observed a crust forming around where the top of Adam touches the container, with oily rainbow-colored spots. I don't know if this is the beginning of the formation of some sort of life form, or if it's just some oil from my skin that found its way into the mixture from my blood or semen. If I had to guess, I would assume that this was all the result of bacteria making its way into the mix and doing its thing, but in any case, this is real progress and it seems to have reinvigorated things a bit. The next update would come a month later. It was on March 23rd of 2008 that he celebrated the birth of Adam 2. No, I said Adam 2, not Adam 22. That comes later, I assume. Although he hadn't given up on Adam 1 and he believed that more changes would eventually come, he wanted to see if things would move along faster if he changed some of the variables. While he had taken care to make sure that Adam 1 would be as sterile as possible, Adam 2 contained substances that he believed would be full of bacteria. After cleaning out a jar that he had previously used to keep a spider in, he filled it with blood and pus from an infected hair follicle and scrapings from his tongue. Although he planned to add more to it, he said the pus was probably a one-time thing. The way he puts it, he claims that pus is the only thing more difficult to harvest than sperm. Which, I don't know, in my life I've not found semen to be that difficult to produce. You know, sometimes I even do it for fun. And judging from the contents of the jars, it doesn't seem like he's exactly been working himself down to where he's shooting powder. Clearly he just needs his zinc and L-arginine supplements. In any case, he expects this bacteria-rich bounty to make Adam 2 develop faster. And reading this, I have the same expectations. And this would in fact be confirmed in a post a few months later entitled, Beyond the First Trimester. Adam 2 is repulsive and vile. Over a month ago, I stopped adding new material to Adam 2 because of the smell. It's really astonishing how such a small volume of a substance, less than 35 milliliters, can have such a pungent, overpowering odor. I always hold my breath before I remove the cover from the jar, but that isn't enough. Even after I replace the cover, the smell lingers in the air and has already filled a significant portion of the room. The smell is one of rot and decay, and is extremely unpleasant, to say the least. He notes that while Adam 1 also has a smell, it's nowhere near as strong and you would basically have to put your nose in the jar to smell it. The pictures provided of Adam 2, which had since had more saliva and tongue scrapings added, kinda look like honey, which I guess in a way this kind of is man honey. He also began yet another experiment, this one much more visually interesting. This one contained a variety of substances that he declined to name. He sealed it and left it in the dark, and in under a month, mold had taken over completely. This massive difference in growth inspired him to potentially try making different versions of Adam 1 and 2. Sealed and unsealed, dark and light. We got a modern day Gregor Mendel right here. The next update would show some major changes to Adam 1's condition. What was once a viscous and colloidal substance was now black and nearly solid. He said that he would poke the surface and would make little dents and peaks, but it would eventually return back to the surface and flatten out. He wasn't sure if this was due to the humid weather they had been having or if this is just the natural course of things with this type of substance. On the other hand, surprisingly, Adam 2 had seen no changes at all, but this hadn't killed his motivation. What I learned from Adam 2 is this: after 3 months, a bacteria-rich substance that is sealed and exposed regularly to light will yield nothing of interest. Of course, that doesn't mean I'm going to pack it all in and give up. It just means I'm going to keep waiting and watching while I start developing new specimens upon which I'll test numerous variables, both in terms of the contents of the substances and the environments in which they're kept. In about 1 month, I'm going to start testing more bacteria-rich substances under various conditions, because these are easier to make than something that more closely resembles Adam. I'll make 3 or 4 new specimens similar to Adam 2 at once. While they're developing over time, I'll start putting together another mixture that is identical in its contents to Adam and keep it in a different environment. He mentions that he'd also started another similar but unrelated experiment that had a bunch of bugs that lived and died in a jar. Did not provide any pictures of this. From that point on though, we would not hear from Future's father for almost another year. He would make one more post on May 11th of 2009. In conclusion, this post is weirdly bittersweet considering, it's about jars of cum and blood. It's probably the most emotional thing I've ever read on this subject, which, I've probably, for better or for worse, read more than most on this subject. What started as a silly, sophomoric pseudoscience project has become so much more. As the ultimate culmination of my scientific curiosities, artistic inclination, and whimsical thinking, Adam has been a resounding success. The results of this experiment, if it ever really had been such a thing, are disappointing to the part of my imagination that first dreamt up this whole thing. The scientist in me is not at all surprised. The artist is beside himself with satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment. And honestly, although I guess it does feel kind of lofty for him to refer to himself as an artist in this context, I've definitely seen similar, but much less ambitious projects presented as art. But ultimately, neither art nor science were his real goals with this project. He admits that this whole thing was much more personal than he let on, and in a way it was kind of a coping mechanism. I stopped taking care of Adam many months ago. Around the time he began evaporating beyond my control due to humidity, I more or less gave up on him. That was probably when I should have been adding fresh blood and semen to him the most, but instead I put him away in a dark cabinet, and didn't look at him more than 3 times within twice as many months. The original feeling out of which Adam was born, loneliness, no longer drove me at that point. Adam had served his purpose to that end, providing me with a de facto companion and an engrossing hobby while I endured the overwhelming pain of feeling completely alone. When my life seemed to be turning around, I no longer needed Adam in that regard. It's good to hear that, for once, the internal struggle that led someone to become a weird guy online was resolved and they came out better on the other end. That being said, although it wasn't his original intention, this whole experience left him with some thoughts about the nature of humanity. Adam has met an end that none of us will be able to avoid. Part of my intention with this project was to create something as unhuman as possible, and see just how human it could become. I did not ever really expect to achieve this in a biological sense. I do feel, however, that I pulled it off in some regards. Adam quickly became human to me, even if his form was composed entirely of dead material that never showed any signs of promising change or developing life. Through the months of neglect, having outlived their usefulness, each of the atoms reverted to piles of dry crust, and in this way, we're more like these jars of blood and cum than we are different. So while Future's father didn't quite succeed in his goals as a scientist, he did succeed as an artist. Because what is art if not a medium through which we can reflect and come out with a better understanding of the human condition? That mold jar though, that shit went crazy. Like this, it just looks like kombucha, honestly. It probably even tastes like kombucha, although I assume he didn't try it. But anyway, that is the story of Adam. Shout out to Yaelzebub on Instagram who suggested this to me like a year ago. And if you like this video, check out my interview with the My Little Pony cum jar guy. I'm out.
You look so